Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a Tuesday. It is the 22nd day of September, and the last time I checked, we are live. We were not able to do a program yesterday. It was totally out of our control. The Skype system, we use Skype to get these programs on the air, and the Skype system was down. Neither Bob and the production studios could get on Skype, nor could I. We tried for half an hour into our regular program time before we finally decided that it wasn't going to come up in time, and we basically jettisoned all hopes of getting on the air live yesterday. And I've kind of crossed my fingers today, hoping that everything would be okay today, and so far it seems to be. So welcome to the Virtual Center. I can't tell you how excited I am to be back on the air with you. It's been just about a full week. It was last Wednesday that we had our last live time together, and it is a pleasure to be with you here at the Virtual Center. Welcome. I've got a few general comments to make as an introduction. Some things have happened during the course of the last week since we've been together. I'd be willing to share with you, and including the Rotary program that I just left about a half an hour ago here in our Beckley Rotary Club meeting, our weekly meeting on a Tuesday. And it was just a couple of general things about that I wanted to share with you before we get back into the 18th century. But I'd like to remind you that we do have a number of ways that you can communicate your thoughts and ideas, concerns, questions, suggestions, whatever they might be, to us, to me directly. It would be a pleasure to hear from you. We have a phone number, and this phone number will get you on the air, so that our other listeners can also benefit from comments or suggestions or questions that you might have. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me one-on-one and not do it on the air, but privately, would be waobrien906 @gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906 @gmail.com. And of course, we do have a Virtual Center Facebook page that's been up and running now for about a month and a half, I guess. If you go to Facebook and you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will gain access to our Facebook page, and I will periodically try to post things on that page, because I would like that page to be kind of a written record, if you will, of some of the issues and some of the topics that we've taken time to consider here at the Virtual Center. Again, it is a pleasure to be with you on this Tuesday. Today is the 22nd day of September, and I welcome you to a live broadcast of the Virtual Center. As I'm sure you know, those of you who are tuned in live now, today is a Tuesday, so our Tuesday programs begin 1/2 hour later than they do on Mondays and Wednesdays. So if all systems are go as we expect they will be tomorrow we will be at our regular start time, and we will have a regular 2-hour program here at the Virtual Center. I mentioned that there are a couple of things that just comments, just general comments, because it's been so long since we've been together. that I really feel like I should at least touch base on a few things. And of course, I guess the first one and the most significant one is the arrival of Pope Francis in the United States today. From what I understand, his first public appearance is scheduled for later this afternoon at about 4 p.m. Eastern Time in Philadelphia. And of course, he is scheduled to address a joint session of Congress while he is here in the United States. And I'm struck by a number of issues and the contradictions and the at least on the surface, the apparent absurdity of some of these things. It is anticipated, and I'm guessing, I mean, never mind it is, that's kind of an impersonal way of throwing out a thought. So let me make it a little bit more personal. I suspect that one of the reactions or one of the outcomes of the Pope's visit is going to be pointed challenges. I'm not going to say attacks because the Pope is a little bit difficult to attack. But there'll be challenges to some of the things that the Pope says, and some of the points that the Pope tries to make while he's here in the United States. I anticipate. Now, I may be wrong, but given the encyclical that he issued in the spring on climate change and the reactions to it, and some of the people who were responsible for some of the most pointed reactions to the Pope's encyclical. Many of those people are still around. To be very blunt about it, many of them are running for president. One of them's not, however, as of yesterday, as we know. And one of the stories that seemed to be jumping out on Facebook this morning was the issue of the Koch brothers specifically seeking to recover some of the campaign money that they have funneled into the Walker for President campaign. There's an item on Facebook which refers to a phone conversation that occurred. I don't know. I don't have any verification of this. I only heard it in the one place. And you've got to be very careful because anybody can put anything on Facebook, as we know. But the suggestion was that Scott Walker hadn't been 10 minutes from in front of the cameras when he announced his withdrawal from the presidential race, that the Koch brothers are on the phone looking for their money back. Now, whether indeed that's true or not, I don't know. But one of the things that's been really prominent in the news on many of the news items over the last couple of days is the story about the former hedge fund manager who purchased the Turing pharmaceutical company and immediately raised the price of a standard drug for treatment of AIDS, apparently, by something like 5,000%. From $13.50 a pill to about $750 a pill. And apparently this fella has been appearing before the media in seeking to justify the increase with the idea that he's looking for a way to generate some quick profit for the company so that the company can engage actively in research and development in order to find better medications and better treatments for some of the people that are in need of this pill. Whatever. All I can think about is the attention that we've been given recently here at the Virtual Center over the difference between self-interest and the public interest and the apparent conflict between them and how some of the framers and some of the founders chose to deal with the contradiction, if you will, of the conflict between self-interest and the public interest. And of course, we're in a period now where there's a whole political agenda aimed at the emphasis on the issue of individual freedom and the assumption that the pursuit of self-interest in the minds of many people in today's world is tantamount to the public interest. And this whole issue of public responsibility seems to have disappeared from the agenda of many people. It seems to me that this over attention or extreme attention being focused on individual freedom, the right to do whatever I want, to the exclusion of any sense of public responsibility at all, is what can produce the kind of increase in price that we are seeing in this particular instance. And it just strikes me as so strange that most of the focus over the next several days is probably going to be on challenges and criticisms of comments that the Pope is going to make while he's here in the United States, rather than attention on this kind of blatant, a blatant sense of I don't know what the proper word would be. I was going to say ignorance of, but it's not ignorance. It's in your face determination to ignore or to challenge or to deny the validity of something called the public interest at all. And the idea that profit and the pursuit of individual wealth without any sense of social responsibility at all is frightening. I think that's the kind of mentality that produces the challenge to climate in the first place. It's that kind of lack of a moral sense or lack of a moral sense of duty to one's fellow man at all that produces this kind of thing. That's what is destroying the planet. It's the same kind of thing reflected in this kind of insensitive, immoral decision to raise the price of a particular item of need when there are very few people who will be adversely affected by that. Adversely affected is a mild form. For people that are seriously ill to do that. I can remember, and this struck me, and these are just among the general comments I had indicated I'd like to open the program with, but I can remember some months ago here at the Virtual Center, we dealt with Kohlberg's idea of morality, the escalating scale of the idea of a moral sense, and his research. Kohlberg was a psychologist at Harvard, and is a psychologist, and I don't believe Kohlberg has passed. I may be wrong. But his research is focused on the issue of morality and the extent to which morality can be taught by society, by a particular culture. And in Kohlberg's in the literature about Kohlberg's idea of teaching morality, there are a number of case studies or a number of examples that are used in order to make the point. And it's really interesting because one of the earliest and most prominent examples is a little story about, and this of course takes place in Germany, about a miracle drug. And this fellow's wife has contracted a fatal disease that can be treated only by this one drug. And the person that owns the right to the drug increases the cost of the drug by a dramatic amount. And the question is, when the price of a drug that literally is a matter of life and death exceeds the ability of the people who need it to pay it, is one justified in resorting to ways which are not considered legal or appropriate or moral or ethical, whatever word you want to use, to gain access to it. And so some of the questions that Kohlberg's research followed up this little story with is, would the lady's husband, the sick woman's husband, would he be justified in stealing the drug in order to save his wife's life if he couldn't afford to buy it? And it raises, serious moral questions about under what circumstances are there conditions in which stealing ceases to be a mortal sin or a violation of the law. Is stealing justified in certain situations? And of course, some people would say yes, and some people would say no. And it raises the whole issue of situational ethics. And Kohlberg's research is based on these kinds of dramatic changes in the base story. What if, And one of the issues that is involved, for example, is while we're focusing on morality, is it fair to just focus on the morals of the person in need of the drug? What about the morality associated with the person who raises the price of the drug beyond the ability of the people who need it to pay for it? And you get into these kinds of questions, and Kohlberg's whole research agenda is based on the idea that we can measure in the responses to these kinds of questions, we can begin to measure the level of morality at which a particular individual is functioning intellectually. By your answers to some of these questions, and by your ability to raise other considerations associated with this, we can begin to measure, to quantify, to gauge the moral level of your thinking and your theoretically, ostensibly on your behavior. And I couldn't help but think of this little story from Kohlberg's research as I was reading accounts yesterday of this particular person who owns this company. I put a little something on Facebook this morning myself about this, and I received a number of comments on it. One of them from a person I know, a friend of mine, made the point that this person had spent $55 million to purchase the company. And the company was in trouble, and then there needed to be an immediate influx of profit. And in essence, the person was almost at the point of trying to rationalize this kind of an increase. And the fact of the matter is, this person had been prior to I don't even know if he still is, but prior to the purchase of this particular pharmaceutical company, which I believe is called Turing, Turing, was a hedge fund manager, which essentially explains where the $55 million purchase price for the company came from. But it also indicates that chances are pretty good that he didn't expend a whole lot of sweat in earning that $55 million. As a hedge fund manager, it's probably money that other people earned, not him. But anyway, that's another issue, a related issue. But anyway, I think these kinds of things are going on all around us. And one of the things that occurred to me is how wonderful it is on a regular basis that we can revert or go back to the 18th century a little bit and look at some of the thinking and some of the people who lived in the 18th century whose thinking and behavior and ideas were substantially above some of the things that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis today. So again, as we think about coming back here at the virtual center to the issues we were dealing with, which was mainly focused on the linkage or lack thereof between the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and we were looking at some of the quotations of David Hume and and James Madison and Thomas Jefferson and James Wilson and others, you begin to look at some of this stuff with a little bit of affection in a way. And the return to the 18th century, at least for a brief time here at the Virtual Center, sometimes can be an escape from some of the realities that are going on around us. With that, let me just again thank you for your willingness to stay tuned on a regular basis to the Virtual Center and for your continued support of the Head On Radio Network, which of course is the network that allows us to bring the Virtual Center to you on a regular basis. So again, thank you. Welcome to the program. Welcome to a visit, however short it might be, back into the 18th century. And thank you for your continued support. And by your vote of confidence, you are basically letting us know that at least some of the things we're doing you find helpful and worthwhile, and you can't know how much that means. So thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to kind of go back a little bit and review or touch a few of the bases that we were on when we were last together, since it was just about a week ago. You'll recall that we were looking at the relationship, such as it is, between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. And more specifically, what I was looking at with some question, some skepticism, was the effort by scholars, political scientists, and others who are consciously working hard to establish a direct connection between the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. These people, which at least in the area of scholarship, fall under the rubric of the so-called natural rights philosophy, these people are those who subscribe to the idea that the Declaration of Independence, but more specifically, one small portion of the Declaration of Independence, an early paragraph where Jefferson talks about unalienable rights coming from the Creator and government being created with a specific responsibility for protecting these unalienable rights, and the idea that when government violates the contract, violates the terms of its creation, by trying to assume more power over unalienable rights than the people who created government are willing to grant it, then the people, according to Jefferson, have not just a duty, not just a right, but a duty to overthrow that government because government has violated the legitimacy of the so-called social contract. And thereby, the people who created government are empowered to overthrow the government which has violated the contract and replace it with a government that will abide by the terms of the social contract. And of course, we know that the terms of the social contract in relation to government are that government's power is limited specifically to the duty of protecting the unalienable rights of the citizens who created it. And Jefferson, in the Declaration, identified these natural rights as the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the question that we were focusing on is, why do those who subscribe to the natural rights philosophy adhere so strongly to it? In other words, is there a purpose? Is there a reason? Is there an agenda? It is my belief, and this is me talking, it is my belief that there is a very specific agenda here, which drives this need to establish the direct linkage between this philosophy of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And that need, that agenda, principally revolves around the issue of property. It is absolutely vital to the natural rights philosophy that there be a connection between the Constitution and the philosophy of the Declaration. Because those who subscribe to the natural rights philosophy are very, very concerned about property rights. They are committed to the principle that Jefferson's declaration, Jefferson's philosophy in the Declaration, is taken directly from the philosophy of John Locke and his second treatise on civil government. In Locke's second treatise, man in the state of nature had certain natural rights. Jefferson called them unalienable. Namely, Locke said, the rights to life, liberty, and property. And if you read Locke carefully, Locke really reduces all three of these natural rights to property by arguing that your life is property. It is property you own, a right you own from the Creator. Only the Creator has the right to violate your natural right to life. You do not. Locke has a long paragraph about the issue of suicide. You do not have the right to take your own life. Only the Creator has that right, because the Creator is the origin of that right. So therefore, your life is your property that you hold from God. And while that property is yours, you are not totally free to do whatever you would do with it. Namely, you are not free to take your own life. You are not free to submit willingly to be a slave, to give control over that life to anybody else, because you have a responsibility to the Creator to protect that life that has been granted to you. So in a sense, Locke is suggesting that when you look at life the way he looks at it, life can be reduced to property. Liberty is also reduced to property in the sense that it is one's freedom in the state of nature that provides access to the ownership of property. In the state of nature, resources are held in common. But Locke makes a very specific point that the right to property emanates from the state of nature and from man's freedom to secure ownership of a piece of the commons for himself by mixing that property, as it were, with his labor. When you expend your labor on a particular piece of the commons to the point that you feel that you have the right to call that particular portion of the commons your own, then that is you have, because you expended your labor, you have a specific right to ownership of that property, which means you have the right to put a fence around it. You have the right to consider it as exclusively your own. You have the right to keep others from access to it. All of that is from Locke. Locke argued in his second treatise, that man's decision to leave the state of nature and to enter into a society and create government was solely for the purpose of protecting his natural rights. Because in the natural rights, since there was no government, there was no coercive force, if you will, the only law that existed in the state of nature was reason. Man's common sense, if you will. Locke argues, however, that the state of nature was not evil. It was not Hobbes's state of nature, where every man was so driven by self-interest that every man ended up to be at war with every other man. That everyone was trying to acquire as much from others as possible, and at the same time to protect what they had from the aggressiveness of those around him. Hobbes argued that that state of nature was a state where man was in a perpetual state of warfare, one against the other. And Hobbes's position was that man's reason told him that this was no way to live. And so therefore man's reason told him that the creation of government for the protection of one's property, one's rights, was the most logical thing to do. But Hobbes also said that because man was so evil, man's nature was so evil, that the government created had to be absolute. Because only a government whose power was the sum total of all the people's power who lived under it, only then would it have a sufficient power to create stability and order and peace in a situation of perpetual warfare. Locke denied that definition of the state of nature. Locke's position was that man's reason, for the most part, maintained a sense of order in nature. Man's reason told him that if I want people to respect my rights, then I have to understand that they have every reason to expect that I will respect theirs. And so consequently, Locke's position is that reason itself is the law of the state of nature. That there is law, what he called natural law, in the state of nature. And it's driven and defined by man's reason. But the problem with that is that when there is a violation of the natural law, it's up to each individual in nature to enforce it. In other words, there's no enforcer, there's no police, there's no army, there's no government. And so consequently, the only enforcement of natural law in Locke's state of nature is self-enforcement, is individual enforcement. Locke's argument then is that man's reason tells him that there's got to be a better way. And that way is government. If we could create a government that was given very specific powers to protect our natural rights, and that's all, its purpose for existence would be to protect the natural rights of the citizens who lived under it, under that government, then that was the contract that government entered into with the people who created it. And, of course, according to Jefferson's Declaration, if government tried to violate that contract, then the people had the responsibility to overthrow that contract. Natural rights philosophers subscribed 100% to the idea that Jefferson's Declaration was taken directly from John Locke. Consequently, they believed that Jefferson's use of the term pursuit of happiness really meant property. But that in order to get the Declaration through Congress, property was a bad term to use. And so these folks believe that Jefferson's replacement of property with pursuit of happiness was really political. It was inserted for purposes of political reality to get the Declaration through Congress. But that in effect they are confident that when Jefferson said pursuit of happiness, he meant property because that's what Locke said. So the question then, or the issue becomes the inclusion of property in the minds, in the philosophy of these natural rights philosophers. The inclusion of property as an unalienable right to Jefferson. As people who are advocates of property rights, as people who are advocates of free enterprise capitalism, as people who subscribe to the idea that government's power must be limited, as Jefferson said, to the protection of natural rights, unalienable rights, and that one of the principal rights to be protected is the right to property. That's the philosophy that these people seek to promote and to defend. In essence, they are relying on the linkage between Locke and Jefferson to justify their advocacy of a contemporary 21st century society where government's power is limited, government size is reduced, the cost of government is reduced substantially, the social aspect of an increased federal budget is eliminated, and the freedom of individuals to pursue and acquire property, no matter how much, is protected, is respected, and is supported historically by the Declaration of Independence. That's the world these people advocate. And within that context, they see the Constitution of the United States being born. The purpose of the Constitution of the United States, they believe, is to implement that philosophy, is to protect people's unalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. Happiness Happiness is the freedom and the ability to pursue and own property and have it protected. And have your right protected to do what you will with your own property. There are no limits placed on the amount of property that you own. It is an unalienable right, which means, according to Jefferson, that it is a right directly attributable to the Creator. Therefore, no individual or no government can interfere with it. It is a philosophy of government that supports and endorses the principal ideas of free enterprise, unregulated capitalism. And that's the agenda that we have been dealing with. I'm checking on the time here because I don't know how much time I'm using here. It's a little bit, about 10 minutes after the top of the hour. So we've got about 50 minutes or a little bit less to go here at the virtual center. The point that we were making when we were last together is that in order to endorse this particular natural rights philosophy, and again, let me recommend a couple of absolutely superb books which will get you into this, although I will tell you it's very, very heavy treading, because there's a lot of good information, a lot of philosophical information and historical information in here. I recommend a book by Michael Zuckert, Z-U-C-K-E-R-T, Michael Zuckert, entitled Natural Rights and the New Republicanism. This book, written by Michael Zuckert, was published in 1994 by Princeton University Press. It is a prize winner. It has received numerous awards. Michael Zuckert is a faculty member, a political science professor, I believe, at Notre Dame University. He is considered to be one of the most prominent and reputable spokesmen for the natural rights philosophy. Let me also introduce to you the name of Alan Gibson. Alan Gibson is a scholar, philosopher, political scientist, who teaches, I believe, I know he's in California. I believe it's one of the state universities within the University of California state system, I believe, but I'm not sure. Alan Gibson has published, let me be detailed here because I have two books and I need to be sure which one occurs first. Alan Gibson's first book that I would recommend is a book entitled Interpreting the Founding. Subtitle, Guide to the Enduring Debates over the Origins and Foundations of the American Republic. Alan Gibson does a fabulous job of laying out the similarities and differences among these different philosophies. His book is published in 2006. It is followed up in 2007, the very next year, with an expanded edition entitled Understanding the Founding, The Crucial Questions. In these two books, Interpreting the Founding and Understanding the Founding, Alan Gibson gives us what I believe is a substantive, very informative overview of these different philosophies, what they are based on, where they are strong, where they tend to break down. But when you read Alan Gibson, there's no question you keep coming back to Michael Zuckert. Because Michael Zuckert's book is an incredible accomplishment. From all that I can deduce, I believe, to the best of my ability, I have tried to cover, explain, as best I can, the natural rights philosophy as I understand it. For me, and I have heard Michael Zuckert speak, and I have heard Alan Gibson make two different presentations on these issues. During annual symposia at Princeton University. Both of them are scholars within the James Madison Institute at Princeton University. Where I begin to have issues with the natural rights philosophy is with the Constitution. Because this philosophy seems to mandate that America's mission is to implement the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence. And the Constitution of the United States is the frame of government designed to do that. In other words, the implication is that the Constitution is a direct result of, is directly driven by, the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence as articulated by Thomas Jefferson. My own background and the research that I've been able to do suggests a problem. And that is that the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence was really not the driving force of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, more than anything else, was Jefferson's effort to justify independence from Great Britain, from the mother country. And Jefferson himself, in his private letters, explained that his goal in the Declaration was not to articulate a new philosophy. Rather, Jefferson says that his purpose in the Declaration was to articulate for all the world to see the self-evident truths which comprised the thinking of thinking people at the time on the relationship between government and citizen. How a republic ought to be structured and how it ought to function. Jefferson says in an 1825 letter to Richard Henry Lee, who made the initial proposal, resolution, before the Congress for independence on June 7th, 1776. In his 1825 letter to Richard Henry Lee, Jefferson explains that his purpose in the Declaration was not to articulate anything new, not to say anything new or controversial, but on the contrary was to briefly state what everybody knew, what the world already believed about man, man's nature, his government, and what powers his government ought to have. Jefferson said that he was not about new principles. He was not about saying things not said before. Jefferson said in this 1825 letter, May 8th, 1825, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent. He assured Lee that the Declaration was not copied from any particular and previous writing, but that it was intended to be an expression of the American mind, unquote. This is what thinking people believed, Jefferson said. And the Declaration's purpose was to state that belief, that frame of mind, that sense of thinking that was prominent at the time. The fact of the matter is, when you look at the debates on the Declaration of Independence and the changes that Congress made in Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration of Independence, almost no time was given in the debate to the paragraph articulating the philosophy. What the natural rights philosophers today claim was the driving force or the essence of the Declaration hardly even received any attention at the time the Declaration was passed. Those who debated it, those who voted on it, did not see the philosophy of the Declaration, that one paragraph, as being the driving force of the document. In the contrary, most of the time during the debate, most of the language in the Declaration, 80 to 90% of the body of the Declaration is addressed to the various changes and charges against the mother country that justify the right of the 13 colonies to be independent from England. That's not only what Jefferson seemed to intend the Declaration to be, that was what the members of Congress who debated it and voted on it assumed that it was. That's what they spent most of their time on during the debate. And the thought that this one paragraph at the beginning of the Declaration was going to become all that there was of the Declaration in today's world never seemed to dawn on anybody in 1776. But it did dawn on Abraham Lincoln 100 years later, because Lincoln recognized that the philosophy of the Declaration would be very, very useful in making his case against Southern rights of secession, and more specifically his case against the legitimacy of slavery, because slavery was in blunt contradiction to the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence. So beginning in the mid-1850s, right up into his election as president in the election of 1860, Lincoln regularly returned to this particular philosophy of the Declaration as justification for ending slavery. It obviously, in the minds of many people, pointed out the hypocrisy of the founders to articulate a philosophy of man's unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and at the same time to practice slavery. But the fact of the matter is, few of the people in 1776 who debated and voted on the Declaration saw that philosophy as being the principal focus of the Declaration. Rather, it was the case against England that they most focused upon. So it raises the question as to whether the charges of hypocrisy against the founders is even legitimate. Because in their own minds, they were able, somehow, to rationalize the legitimacy of slavery in the context of what they were trying to do in terms of arguing for their freedom from the mother country. Lincoln, however, was able to resurrect the founders, more specifically to resurrect the philosophy of the Declaration and make the case that it ought to be America's creed. It ought to be what the American Republic is about. And it stuck. And that's where the natural rights philosophers of today are able to ground their case. In other words, they are implying that what Lincoln said in the middle of the 19th century was what the founders meant in the 18th century. That's a stretch. History does not support that. But most important, what the natural philosophers are out to do is to connect the Constitution to that philosophy. They must insist that the Constitution of the United States is in sync with and directly connected to and exists for the purpose of implementing the philosophy articulated in the Declaration of Independence. In order to do that, they have to ignore or repress 11 years of history between the Declaration of 1776 and the Constitution of 1787. More than that, they have to deny the realities of the evidence which suggests that the Constitution of the United States was designed principally to counter problems with the philosophical idealism of the founding, and to deal with and control problems that emerged in America during the 1780s under the Articles of Confederation. The realities of majority-rule democracy, which became possible under the Articles of Confederation, which became the definition of Republican government under the Articles of Confederation, which was consistent with the philosophy of Republican government articulated by Montesquieu in his Spirit of the Laws. That was the philosophy that was consistent with the Declaration of Independence in 1776. The Constitution of the United States was created and intended to counter and offset and change that philosophy. Consequently, all the historical evidence points to the fact that the Constitution was drafted to respond to the historical realities of the 1780s, not to the philosophical ideas that were floating around in the world in the 1770s. There is nothing in the Constitution of the United States that mentions a creator or a God. There is nothing in the Constitution of the United States that mentions unalienable rights or natural rights. There's nothing in the Constitution to even hint that the power of man, of individual citizens, exceeds the power of the government created under the Constitution. There's nothing in the Constitution of the United States that gives the people the right to overthrow government because it has become too strong or too powerful. Rather, the Constitution of the United States is grounded on the consent of the governed as expressed in ratification by the people in state after state after state. The people of the United States ratified the Constitution. It is the consent of the governed. And within it, there is provision to amend it. There is an amendment process in Article 4. But there's too much in the Declaration, in the philosophy of the Declaration, that does not appear in the Constitution of the United States to make the case that one is the direct product of the other. Rather, there's too much to make the case that that is not even true. We have reached the bottom of our hour, and we have just about 25 minutes left in today's program. So let me kind of introduce yet another wrinkle to this. And if we are unable to complete it, we can perhaps pick it up and complete it on tomorrow's program here at the Virtual Center. Many of you will remember last Wednesday when we were last together live that I had mentioned that I was giving a presentation the following evening, last Thursday. It was the 17th of September, Constitution Day, and that I had been asked to give the Constitution Day lecture at Concord University, where I retired from 2 years ago. And I went down that last Thursday night and made this presentation. And, it was quite well received, I think. But because we were limited, I was limited to about 45 minutes with a Q&A period to follow. It was only possible to give a general overview. It was not possible to go into some of the detailed source materials that made the case in one direction or the other. But I thought that what I would do today, here, toward the end of our program, is to spend a few minutes addressing the theme of that particular presentation, because I think that that theme is not only relevant for that particular venue, but it's relevant today in our thinking as we think about the connections or nature of the connection between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. Some of this we've touched on before, but I don't think I've ever presented it as a thesis or as a theme, or as something to really think about in terms of the way not only we look at history, but the way we look at the contemporary world in which we live. In my presentation last Thursday, I began with an equation. And basically it read this way. Carl Becker is to the Declaration of Independence as Charles Beard is to the Constitution of the United States. What I was suggesting there and what I developed and what I'd like to share with you now is the basis on which I laid out that particular situation. We've talked about some of this before in pieces. In 1922, Carl Becker wrote what is considered to be the definitive study of the Declaration of Independence. The title of his book is The Declaration of Independence. The subtitle of his book is The Study of the History of Political Ideas. So Becker's book is entitled The Declaration of Independence, A Study of the History of Political Ideas. It is a classic. It is a phenomenal job. There's no question that its status as the definitive study of the Declaration of Independence is warranted. But let me mention something else about a definitive study of anything. When something becomes the definitive study, it becomes in the public mind the study itself, or the subject itself. Let me be specific. Carl Becker's book on the Declaration of Independence, as the definitive study of the Declaration of Independence, in the mind of the general public, is the Declaration of Independence. What people know about the Declaration of Independence is what Carl Becker tells them about the Declaration of Independence. Now, I know that most of our general public, of our population, did not sit down and read Carl Becker's book on the Declaration of Independence. I'm not naive enough to believe that. But I can tell you that most of those within our general public attended public school, because in fact the law required that they attend public school. And when they took American history, or when they took American government, or when they took what used to be a class called civic education or civics, they were introduced to the Declaration of Independence. But the fact of the matter is, more than that, they were introduced to Carl Becker's book on the Declaration of Independence. Because as the definitive study of the Declaration, Carl Becker's book on the Declaration becomes the basis for our state education curriculum guides. It's in the curriculum for the presentation of the Declaration of Independence. What Carl Becker concluded the Declaration of Independence to be about is what our young people were taught the Declaration of Independence was all about. And Carl Becker's book established the connection between Jefferson's Declaration and John Locke's philosophy as being unquestioned. Carl Becker said, let me get my quotes correct here. Carl Becker said, Americans had absorbed Locke's works as a kind of political gospel, and the Declaration, in its form, in its phraseology, follows closely certain sentences in Locke's second treatise on government. The lineage is direct. Jefferson copied Locke, and Locke quoted Hooker. As the definitive study on the Declaration of Independence, Carl Becker's reading of the Declaration of Independence as Lockean becomes not theory, not possibility, but fact. Unquestioned, unadulterated truth as it is presented to our youngsters in public school. Consequently, all of our young people graduate believing, knowing, never questioning that Jefferson's Declaration is taken directly from John Locke's philosophy, that the purpose of government is to protect people's unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that pursuit of happiness is a politically correct term for property, and that consequently the legitimate role for government is to protect people's natural rights or unalienable rights, among which is the right to acquire property and have government protect it. This is the purpose for which government was created. This was the contract between the people who created government and the government they created. Government came into existence with limited powers, limited specifically by the terms of the contract, and that therefore correct government, proper government, the right government is small government. It's limited government. It's government that has no right to interfere with anybody's freedom, anybody's property, anybody's right to acquire property, anybody's right to invest property, people's right to own property, people's right to accumulate obscene amounts of property, people's right to the political influence that owning so much property, so much wealth brings to them. All of this is part of the plan. That's what our young people are taught as truth. That is the outcome of a definitive study. Let's look even further at the idea of a definitive study. If the study is considered to be definitive, that means that it stands as unchallenged, accepted truth or fact. That means that there are no other options. There are no other alternatives. If people do try to propose other alternatives, they don't stand much of a chance when brought up against the definitive study. Consequently, when the definitive study makes its way into our curriculum guides and into our classrooms and into the preparation that our teachers are given for teaching this stuff, there are no alternatives. There are no other possibilities. There is merely truth to be memorized, to be accepted, to be transmitted, to be disseminated to those in your classrooms who you will teach. And chances are, if there are other alternatives, you never heard about them. You certainly never read them. And if you did come into contact with one of these other alternatives, knowing what you know from the definitive study, you would be inclined to dismiss it as irrelevant. That, in a nutshell, it seems to me, is what the idea of a definitive study is all about. So when we say that Carl Becker's 1922 book on the Declaration of Independence is the definitive study of the Declaration of Independence, we have to appreciate what that means. It means that the story ends there. It's over. There's nothing more to know. There's nothing more to find out. There are no questions to be left unanswered. Because as a definitive study, it answers all the questions that need to be answered. It seems to me that it is ironic that Carl Becker's subtitle for the Declaration of Independence is a study of the history of political ideas. Because the fact of the matter is, as definitive, Becker's book inhibits the study of the history of political ideas. It inhibits research. It inhibits curiosity. It inhibits asking questions. Rather, because it is the definitive study, it points to the particular historical ideas in the past that lead logically to Locke as the direct source of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. So, contrary to its subtitle, Becker's book is not a study of the history of political ideas. It's a presentation of those political ideas which support the conclusion that Jefferson's Declaration is directly taken from John Locke's second treatise on civil government. End of story. That's what a definitive study means. It means that there's no reason to think about and to speculate and to analyze and to question and to continue to do research on the Declaration of Independence. It's a closed book. But the fact of the matter is, it's not a closed book. Because when you go back to the debates on the Declaration and the passage of the Declaration of Independence by the Continental Congress in 1776, you encounter the fact that none of this stuff that is now so definitive was even debated, was discussed. There was nothing in the debates to indicate that the Declaration of Independence was establishing its place as the creed for the nation to follow, and that every government created and every amendment passed and every Supreme Court decision rendered under the Constitution of the United States after that was to be informed by and framed by that philosophy. So the fact of the matter is, as we've known and we've touched upon in previous programs here at the Virtual Center, there are other alternatives to the Declaration of Independence. And the one that I've mentioned before, and I'll just mention it now because we are running out of time. We've got about 5 minutes left in our, well, actually, it's 51 minutes after the hour, so we've got about 6 or 7 minutes left in our program. So that might be enough time. Let's look for a moment at the issue of happiness. Natural rights philosophers are insistent that Jefferson couldn't say property, so his insertion of the phrase pursuit of happiness was a nice way of not stirring up a hornet's nest by putting the word property in the Declaration. But the fact of the matter is, when you go back to the 18th century, you begin to realize very quickly as you read the sources that the founders had very specific meanings in mind when they used the term happiness. Let me cut and go right to the chase here because of time. What you find is that the 18th century meaning of happiness was definitive. In other words, there was a generally accepted meaning or sense to the idea of happiness. And when Jefferson used the term pursuit of happiness as a self-evident, as part of what he called self-evident truths, he was speaking to the general understanding of happiness as it existed in the 18th century. Happiness had nothing to do with your acquisition or ownership of property, except your ability to use the ownership of that property to benefit other people. Because the fact of the matter is, in the 18th century, happiness referred to the giver, not to the recipient. Happiness was something you didn't seek. Happiness was something you disseminated. You were responsible for giving to other people. In the Scottish Enlightenment school of the 18th century, in the philosophies of Lord Keynes, Adam Ferguson, Adam Smith, David Hume, and others, happiness was something you sought as a way to help others. Lord Keynes said, kindness which is done infers a happiness in the person from whom it proceeds, not in him on whom it is bestowed. Unquote. Happiness is not something you receive. Happiness is something you disseminate. You are able to provide for others. Adam Ferguson says, if the individual owes every degree of consideration to the public, he receives, in paying that very consideration, the greatest happiness of which his nature is capable. What brings you pleasure is the knowledge that you have been able to do good for other people, that you have been able to contribute to the common good or to the public interest, that you have had the wherewithal. Maybe it's ownership of property, maybe it's wealth, but whatever it is, it's your ability to contribute to the welfare of other people that constitutes happiness. Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, which is so prominent in the defense of pre-enterprise capitalism today, Adam Smith makes the point in his essay on moral sentiments that happiness, as it is understood in the 18th century, is what government is all about. Government's principal responsibility is to bring happiness, not to a few people with a lot of property, but happiness to all of those citizens who live under that particular government. Adam Smith, in his essay on moral sentiments, says the following: all constitutions of government are valued only in proportion as they tend to promote the happiness of those who live under them. By acting according to the dictates of our moral faculties, we necessarily pursue the most effectual means of promoting the happiness of mankind. The purpose of government is to promote the public interest, to promote the common good, to deliver happiness to as many people as possible. If you subscribe to the Lockean definition of government's principal responsibility, it is to protect the property of the wealthy. In effect, to subscribe to Carl Becker's definitive study of the Declaration of Independence as Lockean, to subscribe to the philosophy of John Locke as outlined in his second treatise on civil government, is to reduce government from the agent of happiness for all the people to the protector of the private property of a few people against the threat posed by the many who are denied access to that property. In other words, what we are subscribing to by continuing to support unquestioned Carl Becker's approach to the Declaration of Independence as definitive, we are subscribing to a definition of the proper function of government which violates some of the most prominent thinkers in the world of the 18th century. But because Becker's book is definitive, most of us never know that. Our kids never know that. Our kids never question it. We'll have to pick this up tomorrow. We are at 59 minutes after. We have completed our time together today here at the Virtual Center. I want to thank you for tuning in. It's so pleasurable to be back with you. I am so glad to be here. We'll be back tomorrow at our regular time, which is 1/2 hour earlier than today. I want to thank you for tuning in and invite you to join us tomorrow at our regular time. In the meantime, have a wonderful evening. Be safe. Enjoy the beginnings of fall. It is a beautiful time of year. And thank you for your support of the Virtual Center and your support of the Head On Radio Network. Have a wonderful evening. Be safe, and thank you.